In this first session, we want to start really from the beginning. Genesis is the creation account, not just of the universe, not just of our world, but of mankind, and specifically of marriage. In the issue of homosexuality, there are a number of passages that we want to take a look at, but I really believe we have to start at the beginning, at the foundation of this whole entire relationship. When God created man and woman, He created a union, different than anything else at that time. And He wanted that to be the foundation by which we understand relationships since then. The issue of homosexuality is not just about marriage, I realize, but we do have to look at the complementarian nature of sexuality as it's seen in both Adam and in Eve. And to do that, we need to go to the creation account. In Genesis chapter 2, we see this wonderful story. After God has created all these other wonderful things in our world and our universe, He creates man, a unique creation, different than anything else, whereby He stamps the image of God on him. This gives him value and worth far above any other, the pinnacle of His creation. But if you remember the story, you realize that in creating Adam, he realized that he was alone and that this was not good. If you read in Genesis chapter 2, you see that he does something. He first brings the animals to Adam. In doing so, Adam is given a responsibility, a job, very, very early there in the creation account, to name all of the animals. And as Adam is naming all the animals, the text says he realized that none was suitable for him. Now, we understand fully that God already knew this. This was not to give God some information regarding Adam's loneliness, but was for Adam's sake, to help Adam realize that there was nothing in the created order that fit him, that was suitable for him. Well, if you know the rest of the story in Genesis 2, you know at this point, God puts a deep sleep on Adam, and in doing so, opens up his side and removes a rib, closes up the side, and from that rib fashions a woman. All her beauty and all her glory, then presents this woman to Adam. And we see the response of Adam as such. This woman, as he says, is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. We realize this is a unique creation in which Adam now finally has a suitable helper. Moses, as he's writing the book of Genesis, at the end of this chapter then makes a commentary on this creation account. In the bringing of Adam and Eve together, Moses makes this comment in verse 24. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one. Now there's much to say regarding a phrase like this, and they shall become one. Most definitely there are spiritual and emotional, but we have to realize there's also a physical reality of these two coming together, the complementarian nature of a man and a woman coming together. We have to realize this is the standard that God started marriage. He started sexuality with this joyous reality. If you go on, the very last verse in chapter 2 of Genesis says that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Sin had not entered into the story yet. Sin had not polluted this beautiful relationship that God had started. In fact, their sexuality was able to be enjoyed without shame, without guilt or remorse. But it was enjoyed as a man and a woman, as a husband and wife. One of the things we need to do in arguing for a biblical complementarianism is to go to a passage like Genesis chapter 2 and help people understand that this is a clear understanding of what God intends for marriage and for sexuality. One man, one woman for life. Now, many will look at a passage like this. In fact, many will look at the rest of the Old Testament and say, well, many men of God had many different types of sexual relations. You'll see examples of polygamy or maidens or midwives or things of that nature. And they'll say, well, there's multiple understandings. One of the things we have to help people understand is that just because there is abuse of sexual relationships does not give it justification. Even though someone like a patriarch may have multiple wives or midwives, that in no way is God condoning or endorsing that as a normative fashion for marriage. We need to go back to Genesis chapter 2. We need to help people understand and realize that this is the normative function of what marriage and sexuality is all about. While this passage does not deal with the issue of homosexuality in specific, it does lay a good foundation for our discussions as we move on from here. As we do move on, we go to a passage like Genesis 19. Many see this passage as clear evidence of how God responds in light of homosexual behavior. As you know the story, in Genesis 19, two angels come to Sodom in the evening. And as they are there, they come to Lot's home. As the individuals of the city find out about these strangers, they come to the door. They are demanding to have relations with these strangers. Lot offers his own daughters, and we see this story played out in horrific detail as they escape the city and God sends judgment clearly down upon the people. Now, to first understand how some people look at this in supporting homosexuality, they would argue that this passage in Genesis 19 is not dealing with homosexual behavior, or at least it's not dealing with monogamous, same-sex, consensual relationships. Some would argue that this passage is dealing with the issue of gang rape or abusive sexual relationships, that this is not dealing with caring, loving relationships, that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not about people who care for each other, but is a story about people who are abusing each other. Some will continue to look at other passages in Ezekiel chapter 16. They would argue that the real sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not gross sexual immorality, but is inhospitality. If you understand within the Middle Eastern culture, hospitality was an incredibly important reality of everyday life. They didn't have the highways and air service that we have today, and when people would travel from one town to another, it would literally take days. And the hope is that if you came to the end of your journey at the night, you could find someone's house to stay at, that someone would be hospitable to you, let you come into their home, rest for the night, and you'd be on your way. Hospitality was a way of life within the Middle Eastern culture, and is so even today. In Ezekiel chapter 16, they would argue that this sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not sexual immorality, but inhospitality. Ezekiel 16:49 says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom and her daughters, that they had pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Those who advocate for homosexuality say, see, the real sin of Genesis 19 and Sodom and Gomorrah is not sexual immorality, but is inhospitality. It says it there in Ezekiel 16. One of the things we have to admit is, yes, there was a sin of inhospitality in Sodom and Gomorrah. Very clearly, Ezekiel 16 says that. And so by no means are we discounting that. But we also have to remember there's more to be said in Ezekiel 16 as well. That in fact, Ezekiel goes on to say how there was this immorality, sexual immorality, that was happening within Sodom and Gomorrah as well. That not only was inhospitality happening, but that there was also gross immorality happening as well. In fact, if you look later on in the New Testament itself, in the small book of Jude, verse 7, the writer there uses the example of Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of shameless immorality or unbridled in sexual idolatry. This is a clear interpretation of the text there within the text that helps us understand that the behaviors and actions that were happening there in Sodom and Gomorrah were clearly against God's standard. It's true that we have to let Scripture interpret Scripture, but we need to let all of Scripture interpret Scripture and not just take bits and pieces. What we can definitely see from this passage in Sodom and Gomorrah is that there is gross immorality, a sexual sin that was so perverse that God, in His righteous judgment, had to destroy these cities. We need to help people understand that, again, this is against the standard of God, that the behavior of these individuals was not in keeping with the sexual ethic that God had desired. The passages in Leviticus serve as another passage that we can look at that helps us look at how God views the sexual relationship. We need to understand that God is trying to set up a standard. He's trying to set up an understanding of how He wants His covenant people to act. In Leviticus 18, it goes on talking about the relationships they are to have with each other. How a man shall not lay with a man as he lays with a woman, and a woman likewise. And how these relationships are an abomination to God. Now, again, those who advocate for homosexual relationships will look at this passage and say that it's curious how You'll say homosexuality is wrong, but yet you'll eat shellfish. Their point is, if you continue to look in Leviticus, there are other passages that forbid shellfish, eating of pork, the combining of certain fabrics, or the cutting off of your beard on the sides. They would claim that evangelicals are picking and choosing which passages they want to support and which passages they want to disregard. Now, this is an important distinction to make. How do we as Christians use certain passages in Leviticus and say, yes, this is still in play, this is still active for Christians today, and yet there are other parts of the Levitical code that are not in part today? The same discussion extends into Leviticus 20 as well, where this same ethic is brought up. And so what do we say to this? How do we advocate for some laws and not for others? Again, we don't have the time to go into the detail of this issue, but one of the things I think that we can appreciate is to understand that the New Testament, the new covenant by which Jesus Christ inaugurates, does give us help, gives us information of how to interpret the Old Testament, that we're not left to figure out or pick and choose which ones we want. In fact, we have the opportunity to see how the Old Testament is interpreted in the New Testament. Take, for example, the Ten Commandments. Except for the Sabbath commandment, every single one of those commandments are reiterated in the New Testament. Not lying, honoring your father and mother, all of these are commanded of the saints in the New Testament. When it comes to sexual behavior, again, we have clear instances of both what is the norm, man and woman for life, and what is outside of the norm, homosexual behavior, in Romans and in Corinthians. We have the New Testament to highlight and to give us aid as to what is applicable for today and what is not. In fact, even when it comes to something as simple as dietary restrictions, whether in the Old Testament we were not to eat shellfish or lobsters or shrimp or whatever, we clearly have an indication in the book of Acts, in the vision that Peter had when that great sheet came down and he heard a voice saying, "Rise, kill and eat." Peter, in his Old Testament way of thinking, surely said, "Lord, I don't eat these things." The point God was making here was not just dietary, but was about the gospel. But don't miss the point about the diet. God clearly said that what was once unclean is now clean. God himself in the New Testament is helping us understand the laws and restrictions of the Old Testament. What we have to take from Leviticus is an understanding that God has a clear prohibition against certain types of sexual relationships. And when we see this reiterated in the New Testament, specifically in Romans and Corinthians, we have an understanding, a help that gives us understanding of how to apply those laws for today. In fact, one other response we can give to those who advocate for homosexuality is that they themselves do pick and choose Old Testament laws. If you were to ask most of them, do they support incest? I would imagine most of them would say, no, we don't. But clearly that is also a law within the Old Testament. That's clearly a law that they would agree applies for today. And this is something that we can help them understand, that there are rules, there are laws, there are standards that we as God's people are held to, and how we can understand the Old Testament as it's applied in the New. We have to help them understand these ideas. And in the bigger picture, help them understand that there is an ethic that God is wanting to relate to his people as it relates to sexual understandings.